right, thank you for the song this morning. We will be going to Exodus 23, continuing our series through the book of Exodus. This is now message number 29, entitled Purity of the Turf. And purity of the turf, that's an old phrase related to betting on horse racing, of all things, that I read in the book once. Just kind of stuck with me. It just refers to a truly level playing field. So you may have heard of that, you may have not, and so now you have. All right, so Exodus chapter 23, as we continue our series here, I will start with verses 1 to 3. And this is the thing that thou shalt do unto them to how, I'm sorry, I'm in the wrong chapter. Okay, we're not off to a great start here this morning. So may need to reboot. We'll see. Exodus 23. Okay. Wow. Oh well. You can't win them all. All right. So verses 1 to 3. Thou shalt not raise a false report. Put not thine hand with the wicked to be an unrighteous witness. Thou shalt not follow a multitude to do evil. Neither shalt thou speak in a cause to decline after many to wrest judgment. Neither shalt thou countenance a poor man in his cause. So chapter 22 continued the judgments of the law. These were made up mostly of what we would refer to as case laws, which the judges were to use to learn to apply the law. And we also had various commandments that were related to idolatry and to false worship. And Israel was repeatedly warned about the practices of the pagan nations of Canaan that they were not to follow. But of course, these very practices were what became a snare to Israel, to that nation throughout their history in the land. And they tried to blend the keeping of the old covenant with these pagan practices of the nations around them, and ultimately it resulted in their exile from the land. Now, chapter 22 ended on the important theme of the old covenant: be holy. And Israel was to keep God's old covenant law. They were not to be like the unbelieving nations around them. They were to be set apart because they are God's chosen nation that he promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now, one design of the laws that we saw there, and really all the laws that were given with the old covenant, one design of those laws was to make Israel a truly unique nation, to make them different from the nations of the earth, so that they would be a light, they would be a witness to the nations of the earth. Now, chapter 23 is the last part of these judgments that started there in chapter 21. This is referred to later as the book of the covenant in the next chapter. But we have here in chapter 23 a blend of a few case laws and some more statutes. So we get some more of thou shalt and thou shalt not type language in this chapter. One of the things you will notice about this chapter in particular is that there are no penalties here for the judges in this chapter. So in the case laws that we've been looking at, essentially there was penalties, and the judges were involved in assessing those penalties, assessing those damages and the restitutions and such that needed to be made. But here in chapter 23, we're sort of back to the emphasis that ultimately God is the judge, and God is the one that is going to sort of dole out the punishments and penalties as is needed. So the driving concern in the first part of this chapter is what we could call purity of justice, that there is to be a true equality of justice. And so we have a concern about the perversion or the corruption of justice among Israel. So as we look at verses 1 to 9 in this chapter. We see sort of a blend of some case law, and really the concern is due process and the perversion of justice. And then the last part we will look at in verses 10 to 13 give us some Sabbath laws. So beginning here with the due process here in verse number 1, thou shalt not raise a false report. Put not thine hand with the wicked to be an unrighteous witness. Now, we've already seen this command against bearing false witness back in chapter 20 and verse number 16. And we see it here again in terms of false accusation. Witness was vital to the justice system of Israel. Witness was important evidence in condemning or justifying a man or a woman, particularly those that had been accused of some sort of a crime, or even these cases that were being adjudicated between different neighbors and their disputes and things of that nature. Witness was an important part of evidence. So when you think about witness in the Old Covenant law, you can think in those terms. This is evidence. This is key evidence that was to be given. Now, the additional command here, not raise a false report, the putting your hand with the wicked, which is sort of an expression similar to like shaking on it. You know, you're sort of entering into an agreement, maybe an informal sort of type of an agreement. But this is a command against conspiracy and collusion. So regardless of the reason for it, because it is a perversion of justice. So when we have issues of conspiracy and collusion, there can be different motivations. Sometimes there could be political motivations. Someone that's maybe wanting someone to be removed from power, to lose power, to be removed from some sort of office. Someone that's trying to gain maybe a position. There can be political reasons and advantages for conspiracy and collusion. There can be financial motivations for these. Someone looking to make a gain, or even someone looking to maybe cause a loss to someone else. And another strong motive in these cases can also be personal. Issues of revenge, wanting to get even, wanting to strike back at someone, and sort of using the legal process as a means of doing so. And so this is what is being spoken against. You're not to raise a false report, not to give in along with those with evil motives looking to pervert justice and to use the system for their own ends. Verse number 2, thou shalt not follow a multitude to do evil, neither shalt thou speak in a cause to decline after many to wrest judgment. So this command is a warning against going along with prevailing opinion over truth, over justice. Neither truth nor justice are established by popular opinion, majority opinion, or even majority vote for that matter. The underlying concern that is seen here is the concern for the upholding of truth and justice. And again, these to be held in purity. So a witness was not to side with the crowd if the crowd was wrong. And you could also see this working sort of in a reverse way. You weren't to go against the crowd just to be contrary if the crowd in fact was right. In other words, the primary concern is that of truth and justice. It's not what the prevailing opinion is, whether or not this is going to upset people, or whether or not this is something that everybody wants or everybody doesn't want, or whatever the case may be. So there could be various reasons for this, and oftentimes this sort of prevailing opinion, which we could even refer to as sort of a mob rule, it can be a very strong persuading factor. There's a lot of pressure that can come, pressure to conform to that opinion that is held by many. There can be a strong desire within us. We don't we don't necessarily like to be disliked, and we can see sometimes that we could lose out on popularity, or maybe even hoped for friendships, and whatever that the case may be. There's a very strong allure to being in a position to speak to others, and especially when the crowd cheers you. When you receive the applause of a crowd, there could be a very strong temptation there to try to get more of that. And so the point here is that Israel was to look to God and to be governed by Him, not by what might be the popular opinion of the day. Verse number 3. Neither shalt thou countenance a poor man in his cause. Now, there's another verse later in verse number 6, which is essentially kind of looks at both sides of this issue related to the poor, and the poor are specifically mentioned here. So both of these forms of giving countenance to the poor result in a perversion of justice. In one way, the poor person could be despised and therefore be denied justice, looked upon as being insignificant, as being trivial, and not worthy of justice in this case. And on the other hand, the poor could be favored. And in other words, justice could be bent toward favoring the poor because of their station. And what's ironic about this is that just as much denies justice, because actual justice is not carried out in either of those cases. So what we learn, and of course the poor are one particular example here, but justice is not altered. It's not dependent upon the person. It's not dependent upon their status. It's not dependent upon their class or whatever it is, whether rich or poor or whatever that the case may be. So the man, for instance, with more money was not entitled to more justice, for instance, than the man with less. Justice was to be completely pure, once again, completely equal. The poor were not to benefit likewise from what today we would refer to as reverse discrimination and sentimentality. So in other words, the poor weren't to be favored in judgment because of their status or their class and so on. Now that doesn't mean that the old covenant had no concern for mercy and compassion. But again, we're looking at case law. We're looking at judgments within Israel. There's plenty of mercy and compassion within the old covenant and within the laws in various places. The issue here is about perverting justice, whether it is in ways of despising someone because of their status or class, or favoring them because of their status and class. Both of those are a perversion of judgment. So that's the issue: justice and legal judgment. Look at verse number 4. If thou meet thine enemy's ox or his ass going astray, thou shalt surely bring it to him again. Now, the next couple of verses give what we might refer to as sort of Good Samaritan laws. But the word for enemies is interesting here, and it can be enemy as we would think of enemy, but it can also be more personal and more the idea of an adversary. And it could refer to someone, in fact, that you could be engaged in a legal dispute with for some reason. So an opponent, you might say, in that sense. It could also be a personal adversary. It could refer to someone within the community of Israel, someone that you don't like, someone that you don't get along with very well, someone that you have some personal animosity toward for whatever reason. And that is the sense that's being used here, not the sense of like an enemy nation that you're fighting with a sword and a spear and that sort of thing, but more of that person within your community that you just don't get along with, you're just at odds with for whatever reason. So the enemy is mentioned because it's already assumed that you would help out your friend. or you would even help out a neighbor that you were more neutral toward. That's already assumed. The point here is that justice requires an equal treatment. And here the command is to help the one that you don't like, or the one who does not like you. So you bring the stray animal back, was the point. Don't ignore it. Verse number 5. If thou see the ass of him that hateth thee lying under his burden, and wouldest forbear to help him, thou shalt surely help with him. So likewise, this goes along with the previous. You see your enemy, your adversary, your opponent, whoever that it is. You see them with his beast of burden that is under a load, and the load may be too heavy. The load may have maybe shifted in such a way that the animal can't get up with it, whatever that the case may be. And so obviously this load would require some help. And the command here wants to help him, not to ignore it, not to just go on like you didn't see it, but to help him. And you say, but that's my adversary. That's the guy I just don't like. I just don't care for him. We don't get along, and he's done this or that, or said this and that about me, and whatever. And the command is that you help him. So laws like this show us that it's not enough to do no harm. In other words, this is going beyond just saying, don't harm your enemy, your adversary. Don't harm them. This is going more than that. It's saying actually help them. So rather positive good is required, not just not doing harm. And so we could sort of summarize it and say that it is a command that means to return good for evil. And this again is within the community of Israel. Verse 6, thou shalt not wrest the judgment of thy poor in his cause. All right, so this is the companion verse to verse 3 that we looked at earlier, that really looks at both sides of partiality toward the poor, whether it's on the one hand denying the poor justice because of their status, or on the other hand favoring them because of their status. Now, here he speaks of denying that justice to the poor, and this is summarized later, Leviticus chapter 19 and verse 15. Ye shall do no unrighteousness in judgment. Thou shalt not respect the person of the poor, nor honor the person of the mighty, but in righteousness shalt thou judge thy neighbor. And this again is talking about that purity of justice, a true equality in the law, and not certainly the perversions of equality and such that we see in the world today, and even within our own country. Verse number 7, keep thee far from a false matter, and the innocent and righteous slay thou not, for I will not justify the wicked. So verse 7 sort of gives us a summary of justice and the implications here to this point. Justice is defined by God. He is the judge of all the earth. Justice was not left up to Israel to decide what they believed to be fair, what they believed to be equitable. It is determined by God. It's defined by God. He says, he will not acquit the wicked. In other words, God is the judge of all the earth. And regardless of how well or how badly the judges of Israel may get their judgments, God's not going to acquit the wicked. Human courts and human judges and such, they get it wrong, sometimes purposely, sometimes not purposely, but they get it wrong. But God will not at all acquit the wicked. He will hold every person responsible for every sin. And here again, we're seeing a principle that's actually universal. This is not just for the nation of Israel. This is God as the judge of heaven and earth, whom Abraham said would do right. He will judge every person for every sin and will not acquit, justify. He will not clear the guilty in any way. So if you want to know just how serious and how inflexible that God's justice is, and that might even seem a shocking statement. God's justice is inflexible. Well, if you want to know just how inflexible that God's justice is, all you need to do is look to Calvary, where his only son was executed under the curse of the law. Paul put it this way in Romans chapter 8, verses 31 and 32. What shall we then say to these things? If God be for us, who can be against us? Of course, he's talking here about being accused by others. And he says of God in verse 32, he that spared not his own son, but delivered him up for us all, how shall he not with him also freely give us all things? And of course, Paul there is talking about justification and condemnation. And he says, if God has justified us, who could possibly condemn us? He didn't even spare his own son. So if he's justified us, who's going to condemn us? So again, this is a very serious warning about justice, about what justice means, how that it is defined, and how that it is judged. Verse number 8, and thou shalt take no gift, for the gift blindeth the wise and perverteth the words of the righteous. So the perversion of justice is, of course, often accomplished by bribery, the giving of a gift given for that purpose. It could be money. It could be favors. It could be property. It could be all sorts of things. Anything that's used sort of as leverage in order to turn justice one way or another. And there's repeated warnings about this throughout the Pentateuch, throughout the rest of the Old Testament, in the wisdom literature. There's plenty of wisdoms about, or plenty of warnings about perverting justice through bribery. And it's a strong temptation. And we're told here, it blinds the eyes of the judge. It perverts the words. In other words, the guilty are oftentimes justified and the innocent are condemned through this sort of perversion of justice. Verse 9, also thou shalt not oppress a stranger, for you know the heart of a stranger, seeing you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Now, at first glance, this verse might seem to be off topic, as sort of just a random collection of various laws. But really, this is another issue of justice. And he's describing, again, complete and fair equality of justice. He says to Israel, you know what it is to be a foreigner in a foreign land and to be oppressed. And so don't do that to others, he says. So this applied to the foreigners in their midst, whether they were proselytes or not. And of course, we know that even at this very time here at the foot of Sinai, they had a number of Egyptians that were with them within their number that left Egypt with them, that they're referred to as a mixed multitude. So they most likely included some Egyptians as well as probably some other slaves that from other nations that were in Egypt as well, and saw this as their opportunity to get out and to get free. So they had foreigners in their very midst, even as these words were spoken. And the word for oppressed that's used, it means to press or to squeeze, which is a pretty good imagery of what is being spoken of here. Don't mistreat, don't take advantage of, don't deny justice to them and equality of justice. And then we get to verses 10 to 13. And these verses deal with sort of an expansion of Sabbath laws. Verse number 10, and 6 years thou shalt sow thy land and shalt gather in the fruits thereof. So one of the things that we learn from these Sabbath laws was that justice also required rest. In other words, for there to be for justice to exist in their community, they had to be at rest. They had to have rest and peace, in other words. So this begins a small set of Sabbath laws. For 6 years, they were to tend their fields and their vineyards as normal. In other words, all the work that went into the preparing, the sowing, the reaping, and everything that went into doing that as the normal course of life. Of course, they had no fields. They're encamped at the Mount Sinai at this point, but they're going to come into that land, and so this old covenant is looking forward to that. So for 6 years, they were to do this as normal. Verse 11 says, "But the 7th year thou shalt let it rest and lie still, that the poor of thy people may eat, and what they leave the beasts of the field shall eat. In like manner thou shalt deal with thy vineyard and with thine olive yard." So the 7th year then was to be a fallow year, and I think some of the newer translations even use that term, let it lie fallow. To be a fallow year. In other words, they weren't to do anything to those fields. They weren't to do anything to the vineyards. They were to let them rest. And whatever grew of its own during that 7th year was to be for the poor that was among them, and also for their animals after that the poor among them had reaped. And so this also shows, once again, how that the old covenant with its legal code certainly required faith, because they had to have faith in God that he would bless in the 6 years so that they wouldn't starve in the 7th. And obviously there's an echo here even of the way that God provided the manna. And on that 6th day of the week, God provided a double portion of the manna for them. And so on the 7th day, they could rest, and they had enough provision so that they didn't go hungry on the 7th day. So they had to have faith. And certainly these are ways by which they are being tested and by which they are being proved. Verse 12, 6 days thou shalt do thy work, and on the 7th day thou shalt rest, that thine ox and thine ass may rest, and the son of thine handmaid and the stranger may be refreshed. Now, there are actually many Sabbaths in the law besides the weekly Sabbath, and they all had their various requirements. This Sabbath in particular is the weekly Sabbath that's being referred to. The sabbatical year, the seventh year Sabbath that we saw just previously pertained to the fields and such. The Sabbath was later said to be a sign between God and Israel, and the penalty for breaking it very severe. So let's just look ahead to Exodus chapter 31, verses 13 to 17. "Speak thou also unto the children of Israel, saying, Verily my Sabbaths ye shall keep, for it is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that ye may know that I am the Lord that doth sanctify you. Ye shall keep the Sabbath therefore, for it is holy unto you. Everyone that defileth it shall surely be put to death. For whosoever doeth any work therein, that soul shall be cut off from among his people. 6 days may work be done, but in the 7th is the Sabbath of rest, holy to the Lord. Whosoever doeth any work in the Sabbath day, he shall surely be put to death. Wherefore the children of Israel shall keep the Sabbath, to observe the Sabbath throughout their generations, for a perpetual covenant. It is a sign between me and the children of Israel forever. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, and on the 7th day he rested and was refreshed." Again, one of the designs of these laws was to set Israel apart from the other nations of the earth. And built into that, into the very rhythms and cycles of their life, they were to observe these things that were signs, that were visible tokens of the covenant between them and the Lord. Verse 13, "And in all things that I have said unto you, be circumspect, and make no mention of the name of other gods, neither let it be heard out of thy mouth." Now, circumspect, a very old word that we don't really use commonly today, means to keep guard or to keep a watch over. Today, we might say pay attention to, something along that line. And so the command here is to pay attention to all that God said and obey it. And God's word was to be in their mouths, not the names of false gods. In other words, they were to be governed by God and truth. So verse 13 really captures the essential command: do everything God said to do. Now, if we think back to the purpose of the covenant, and we spent some time on that in Exodus chapter 19, verses 5 and 6. Now, therefore, if ye will obey my voice indeed, and keep my covenant, then ye shall be a peculiar treasure unto me above all people, for all the earth is mine. And ye shall be unto me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words which thou shalt speak unto the children of Israel. And remember this, there were some laws had been given at this point, but not a lot had been given at this point. Many more were to follow, and we're seeing some of these following now. They were to listen. God said very plainly to listen to every word of God and obey it. And that was the first thing that Moses took back to the children of Israel there from Sinai. And the nation, the people of Israel, the people group of Israel said as a nation, we will do it. We will listen to God's voice and we will obey His words. And that really was the key issue in this covenant that God was making. And now we're starting to see some of these commands and some of these various aspects. But really, once again, this is one of those universal principles. It's included in the Old Covenant as well, but it exists outside of it. This is what God requires. Do everything that God said to do. Don't do what God said not to do. So this isn't only an Old Covenant idea, but it's the supreme law of God to all men. Obey every word of God. Now, we saw this not too awful long ago in the New Covenant law of Christ in the Sermon on the Mount. If you think back to the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapters 5 through 7, Jesus spoke there as a lawgiver with absolute authority. Remember at the very end of chapter 7, he had finished all of that he had to say there, and men were astounded. He didn't speak like scribes. He didn't speak like any teachers that they had heard. He spoke as one having all authority, able to command and require men to obey his words. They were astonished. 13 times in that sermon, he said something to the effect of, I say to you, I am telling you, these are my words that you must hear and obey. 5 times referred to his words and the necessity to keep them. 60 commands or so there in the Sermon on the Mount were issued. And he spoke of entering the kingdom as entering into life, being contingent on obeying his words. And we have, of course, his summary conclusion there in Matthew chapter 7, verses 24 to 27. Therefore, whosoever heareth these sayings of mine and doeth them, I will liken him unto a wise man which built his house upon a rock. And the rain descended, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat upon that house, and it fell not, for it was founded upon a rock. And everyone that heareth these sayings of mine and doeth them not shall be likened unto a foolish man, which built his house upon the sand. And the rain descended, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat upon that house, and it fell, and great was the fall of it. So again, this is the absolute supreme law of God to all men. Obey His word. Now, of course, Christians today, we're not Israel. We're not under the Old Covenant with Israel. The Old Covenant has passed away, and God has made a new covenant, as He said, with the house of Israel and with Judah. Paul knew that. Paul knew that he wasn't under the Old Covenant law, but he clarified that didn't mean he lived without law. And for some reason, people make that jump, and I really don't know why. Oh, we're not under the Old Covenant. Well, then we can do whatever we want. Murder's okay. Adultery's okay. Theft and perjury and all that's just okay. Everything is on the board. I don't know why people make that jump, but they do. Paul said, I'm not without law. I'm under the law of Christ. That's what he said in 1 Corinthians chapter 9 and verse 21, which we saw Jesus emphasizing just as well in the Sermon on the Mount. Keep my words. Just like God is saying to Israel here, that is the issue. Now, again, everything that God told Israel to do, he's not telling us to do today. We have the rest of his word. We have the new covenant law of Christ. We understand what God has told us to do. And the issue again is to do it. To do it. Not to debate it, not to change it, not to modify it, but to do it. Submit to it, just as he is speaking to Israel. All right, that's all of the message for this morning. We will close with a hymn.
We will